back to the fourth and final part in our lecture on violence, crime, and punishment. As we've seen in the earlier parts of the lecture, crime and violence is an important public policy issue in both Canada and the United States. How we punish those who commit such violence is an equally significant consideration for both Canadians and Americans. And of course, we recognize both similarities and differences between the two nations when it comes to dealing with crime and punishment. Now we head south, once more to Mexico. Violence and crime in Mexico are often highlighted in the media. A spectacular killing spree by a drug cartel, keen on sending a very public message to its rivals, Mexican officials, or even just ordinary Mexicans, can garner international headlines. Violence can sometimes be linked to political corruption, another particularly difficult and some might say pervasive problem faced by Mexico. Even the occasional, though troubling, murder of international tourists highlights Mexican crime and violence to those outside the country. In this part of the lecture, we'll certainly deal with the impact of the drug wars, political corruption, and Mexican crime more generally. And after doing so, I'll grant that you're not exactly likely to consider Mexico to be a peaceable kingdom. But remember, even Canada's claim to that particular label is suspect. I do hope that you'll come to see that the state of affairs in Mexico with respect to crime and violence is complicated. Just as we needed to be cautious about making generalizations when examining Canada and the US on this issue, much the same holds true for Mexico. Beware the generalization. Earlier in the course, we discussed narco-trafficking and touched on the emergence of powerful drug cartels in Mexico that particularly came to prominence once American authorities limited the capability of Colombian drug cartels to ship their narcotics through the Caribbean and Florida. As the primary drug trade routes shifted into and through Mexico, organized crime took hold. As the drug cartels fought for supremacy, and particularly when a power vacuum developed after one particular leader or group was eliminated, periodic surges in violence were typical. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, the Mexican government took a relatively passive approach to all this. In fact, as we'll see later in the lecture, political corruption and interconnections between the cartels, and particularly local governments, were not uncommon. This all changed dramatically with the election of President Felipe Calderón. Within days of assuming office, he dispatched 6,500 federal troops to the state of Michoacán, with orders to end the drug violence there. This was the beginning of what has come to be known as the Mexican drug war. Throughout his presidency, Calderón escalated this military campaign against the cartels, involving ultimately nearly 50,000 state and federal police. Estimates of those killed in the drug war vary considerably, wildly even. Certainly the dramatic increase in drug war-related murders shown in this graph is fairly typical of most assessments. The total number killed may well be above 100,000, though the Mexican government asserts that 90% of victims are members of the cartels. Military and police personnel may represent as much as 7%. A key point to be made here is that drug war-related violence certainly impacts most Mexicans in some way, but the vast majority of actual casualties or murders in the war come from those engaged directly in the fighting between cartels or between cartels and government forces. And the violence also varies considerably by region. This map shows us the states, those colored in shades of red, that are most dramatically impacted. Corruption is yet another important dimension of crime as a public policy issue in Mexico, more so than might be the case with the US and Canada. While there may well be some methodological difficulties with Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, this graphic, produced from its 2013 study, does suggest that Mexico is perceived to suffer from the greatest degree of corruption of the three North American nations. The Calderón government's prosecution of the drug war was certainly made more difficult by corruption in the military, police forces, and government ministries. The cartels are known to infiltrate and intimidate all levels of government, but especially the more local ones. They will use their influence to guarantee votes to certain political candidates on the condition that once in office, cartel activity will be ignored. Even members of the Federal Investigative Agency, the very unit responsible for fighting corruption and organized crime, were associated with drug cartel corruption. One report by the Mexican Attorney General found that some 1,500 of a total of 7,000 agents had been investigated for some sort of criminal activity. More than 400 faced criminal charges. The whole agency had to be restructured in 2009 and is now known as the Federal Ministerial Police. The Mexican military is also not immune to corruption. Mexico's Human Rights Commission has received thousands of complaints of military abuse since the beginning of the drug war in 2006. There are suggestions that many high-ranking generals and senior officers are in fact under the influence of the cartels. Corruption is clearly a problem in Mexico that has much greater relevance for the larger issue of crime and violence in society as a whole. This is much more the case for Mexico than Canada and the United States. It really is a matter of scale and how pervasive the issue is. I'm certainly not suggesting that corruption does not exist in the other two countries as well. Just in Canada, we can easily point to accusations and allegations of corruption involving contracts in the construction industry in certain provinces or municipalities. And this, in the country that, according to that Corruption Perceptions Index I noted earlier, is the least corrupt of the North American nations. To end this part of the lecture, it's perhaps useful to return to the one indicator of violence in society that we've been able to examine in the other two countries as well, the homicide rate. I pointed out earlier that the US and Canada had far lower homicide rates than was the case in Mexico. Recall that the 2012 figures were 1.6 murders per 100,000 population in Canada, 4.6 in the US, and 21.5 in Mexico. Now, having reviewed the situation in Mexico, particularly in terms of the drug war, we can perhaps better appreciate why Mexico's homicide rate is so much higher. But it does appear that Mexico may well be finally turning a corner on this one indicator of violence in society. More recent figures are suggesting that a downward trend in homicide is continuing. As recent as 2011, the rate is equal to 24 homicides per 100,000. It had then dropped to the 21.5, and now it seems to have dropped further to 19 per 100,000. Some analysts have associated the downward trend with the more low-key approach to the drug war taken by President Enrique Peña Nieto. Sharper declines in northern states like Nuevo León and Chihuahua, long plagued by the drug wars, that seem to support that view. This holds out the hope that the rate will decline further and may in fact soon reach 16 or 17 per 100,000. And I think it's worth emphasizing at this point that there is significant regional variation at the sub-state level. As I've discussed these homicide rates, they of course apply to countries as a whole. But if you break down those rates further by provinces and states within countries, you can see how much variation exists. This regional variation was something we noticed, remember, when we were discussing Canada. The key point here is that certain states or provinces, even cities, in Canada or the US, would have higher rates of homicide than would be the case for areas in Mexico. Once again, this suggests that we do need to be cautious about generalizations formed at the national level. Still, political corruption and the drug wars do certainly pose a systemic problem in Mexico that compromises the ability of governments there to effectively address issues of crime and violence in society. While those conditions continue to exist, Mexico will undoubtedly face persistent difficulties in its attempts to provide even greater security for all its citizens. That's it for this final part of the lecture. We'll see you in class.